I just wanted it half. You had the spotlight on full. I just wanted it on half because I want them to see this board over here. I don't know. They can see it? Yeah? Okay, good. Okay, so hi everybody. Thank you all for coming. What an exciting evening we had last night. I have to say, full of surprises, full of surprises. And I wanted to spend most of the class to talk about the election yesterday. And then I have two other really interesting things that I read about that I wanted to talk to you about, but I wanted obviously to talk about the election first. So first of all, why were the results surprising? So it depends how far back you want to go. As we all know, before Trudeau resigned and before Trump had his brilliant ideas to take over Canada, the Conservatives were more than 20 points ahead in the election. And if we go backwards a little bit, if we recall just a little bit, when Trudeau was still in office, there were two by-elections that were held in the two of the safest seats in all of Canada. One was here on the island of Montreal in LaSalle, which the Bloc won. And the other one was in Toronto, St. Paul's, which is really in the heart of the city of Toronto, which the Conservatives won. And those two victories should have told Mr. Trudeau to leave right away. Because if the Liberals lost those two seats, it means that they would probably not get more than 50 seats in the whole country, the way the sentiment was at that time. Well, we had to wait till 2025 for Justin to resign. And roughly, he resigned, and right away the Liberal score went up. And then it went up even more when Trump came out with his fusillade against Canada. The tariffs against Canada, the threats to take over Canada, and the just general aggressive tone that he took toward Europe, the Allies, and of course towards Mr. Zelensky running a war against Russia, now 3 years going. So all of these things changed the political atmosphere in Canada completely. And with Mark Carney as the new leader, who was let's say, governor of the Bank of Canada, governor of the Bank of England, not a charismatic leader, but certainly a competent leader without any kind of real black marks against him, without any real enemies against him. Right away, the polls changed direction completely. Now they changed direction completely to the point where at one point there was a 94% chance of the Liberals winning a majority government. A majority government, a 94% chance. By the time the election came, in other words, in the last few weeks of the election campaign, or even in the last 10 days, there was a shift that was going back to the Conservatives. And as I said to you in the last class, this is very normal, because when a leader gets elected, when a leader gets chosen for to lead a party, very often there's a bump in the polls. So there's a bump in the polls going up. And as I mentioned last week, if you remember, when Harris took over from Biden, there was a jump in the polls. And the same thing happened, of course, with Carney. Then things tend to settle down to what they were before. The last call that I saw, which is 1 day or 2 days before the election, the Liberals' chances of winning a majority went from 94 at the high to 74. But still, 74 is a pretty high number. So in other words, the polls were saying that the Liberals had a 74% chance of winning a majority. And of course, the election results were that they didn't win a majority. So that was a surprise. But you have to also remember that the polls that I'm referring to are an aggregation or an aggregate of polls. So that means that the last polls taken were more accurate than the ones in the previous weeks. So meaning that the Conservatives were going upwards as the Liberals were going downwards. And when the elections were actually held and I was watching the results, the results, of course, are not completely in. The reason being that there's a lot of close seats that haven't been determined yet. But still, the results are that, if you take the leading and the elected, the Liberals have 168 seats. We'll write this down. $168. The Conservatives have 144, which is much, much higher than they were predicted to have gotten even 3 weeks ago. There were some polls showing that they might get as less than 100 seats. At the most, the biggest lead that the Liberals had, they were looking at getting something like 210 seats, and the Conservatives were getting under 100 seats, something like 90, I don't forget, 95, something like that. So look at the difference between, let's say, 3 weeks ago and the actual results. You can see the big shift that happened toward the Conservatives in the last 10 days of the election. So that's quite significant. Now, the Bloc Québécois came in third place with somewhere around 23 seats. And at the least, when the Liberals were at the highest, the Bloc was looking only at 16 seats. So you can see there was besides the Conservatives coming up from the low, the Bloc also came up from the low. So that's another significant movement in the last week or 10 days. All right, now the NDP, the NDP is looking at 7 seats. And their lowest prediction was 5 seats. But they really kind of fell as much as the polls were saying. And the Green Party ended up with 1 seat, and they were actually looking at 0 seats. So this is from the lows to what actually happened. And this is the latest results. Now there are within this bunch of seats, there are 23, there are 24, 26, 28 seats of this total that are not completely solid. So of the ones that are not solid, in other words, the counting hasn't finished yet because they're so close, the Liberals are leading in 13, the Conservatives are leading in 11, the Bloc is leading in 2, and the NDP is leading in 2. So if you add these to this, if you add this up to the ones that are already won, you get these totals. So you can see a majority is 172 because there's 3. Yeah, all the numbers on the top include the numbers on the bottom. That's right. And a majority is 172 because there is 343 seats altogether. So one more than half makes 172. So look at how close the Liberals have got to a majority. Close, but not quite. You know, that's what it is. So if everything stays the way it shows, in other words, the way this is, the Liberals will need somebody else to help them to get a majority. They, assuming the Conservatives are against the Liberals, then either the Bloc or the Quebec NDP or both of them have to join up with the Liberals to pass any kind of laws. And if all the opposition parties are so angry at the Liberals for something, they can get together and defeat the government even in the first week. But obviously, who wants to go through an election again, right? Shock of shocks. Shock of shocks. The leader of the Conservative Party lost his seat. The leader of the NDP lost their seat. So there isn't going to be any kind of fast election anytime soon. This setup here looks like it could last, a full term. Remember, in the last parliament, the Liberals had also a minority government, but a much weaker minority government than they have now. So that's the sort of result of the results. The closest seat, there's always a contest to see who's got the closest seat. And the closest seat of all places, and I mean of all places, is in Terrebonne, Quebec, which is north of Laval, just north of Laval. The PQ had just won a by-election in that same seat when the Minister of Finance, Pierre Fitzgibbon, resigned. A by-election was held, and the PQ won the seat. Remember, in Quebec, we have 3 nationalist or sovereigntist type parties. We have the CAQ, we have the PQ, and we have the Quebec Solidaire. So imagine that the PQ won that seat, and the PQ doesn't have a lot of seats in Quebec now. They're maybe up to how many? 3, 4, 5? Not much. And they won the seat. And in the federal election, right now the Bloc Québécois is leading that seat by 28 votes. 28 votes out of somewhere around 40,000. Somewhere around, maybe 22 and 20, more than 40,000 votes were cast in that riding. Close to 50,000 votes were cast, and the lead by the Bloc is 28 out of 50,000. So that's the closest seat, the closest one. The seat that was the least close, in other words, where one party won well over 80% of the vote, that's always in Alberta, one in Alberta and one in Saskatchewan, where the Conservatives have somewhere like 84%. The Liberals did the worst in that seat in Saskatchewan, where they got 11% of the vote. So it just shows to you how there's such interesting divisions in the country that are played out and showed by the election results. So this is page 1. I'm going to go into quite a bit of detail. Why? Because it's interesting. And it shows where Canada is. So if you want to stop me and ask a question, you could do that. So this is the seat total. Let's look at the percentage of the vote total. So the percentage of the votes, right? Now, in this case, the Liberals actually got 43.5% of the vote. Now, when you consider how many parties are running, right? The Liberals, the Conservatives, the NDP, the Bloc, the Greens, and the People's Party of Canada. So those are the main there's a bunch of other little nobodies, but those are the main parties that got, votes in the thousands. When you consider that there were all those parties running, for the Liberals to get 43.5% of the vote, that's a pretty strong showing. The Conservatives, however, also got a very strong showing. 41.4. Now look at that. I mean, in the last election and the previous election, the Liberals got fewer votes than the Conservatives. In Trudeau's last two victories, he got less votes than the Conservatives. This time, the Liberals got more votes than the Conservatives. But what's so interesting about this? If you add the two numbers up together, you get 85% of the vote went to just the first two parties. Now that's really unusual in Canada, because the Bloc Québécois and the NDP are two very strong parties. Now normally they alone would get, in the total amount of votes, they alone would get, the NDP would get 12, 14, 15%. The Bloc Québécois, of course, would get all their votes from Quebec, but it would amount to somewhere around close to 10% of the total votes in the country. So one of the key things that happened here is that all the small parties lost their votes to the big parties, and especially to the Liberal Party. And that's why the Liberal Party won this election in almost getting a majority. Not because the Conservatives voters changed their minds and voted for the Liberals. That's not what happened. The Conservatives kept almost all of their votes. But the NDP votes collapsed, the Bloc Québécois vote half collapsed, and all of those votes ended up in the Liberals' pockets. And that's how the Liberals won this election. So what so the BQ in the total of the votes of Canada, I keep losing my place here. They got 6.4%. And the shock of shocks, the NDP got fewer votes. The NDP got fewer votes in the whole country than the Bloc Québécois did in the whole country, and the Bloc Québécois only runs in Quebec. So it shows you how bad the NDP did in this race. And also the two are smaller parties. The Green Party only got 1%. Now they normally get something like 4%. So they lost most of their votes that they had before. And the People's Party of Canada, the PPC, they didn't even get 1%. And in the polls, they were showing that they would get 2% of the total vote. So, no, this should be like this, less than 1. So this is the total of percentage of votes that were received. And you could see how they correspond to the seats. There is a correspondence. And there's a fairly good correspondence in this case. A fairly good correspondence. So you could see that the Liberals got less than half the vote and they got less than half of the seats. The Conservatives got less than the Liberals, and they also got less percentage than the Liberals and less than the Liberals in seats. The Bloc Québécois, they got less than 10% of the seats and less than 10% of the vote. And the NDP, the same thing. So, in this election, you could say that the percentage of the votes and the percentage of the seats sort of, they're never equal, of course, but they sort of followed each other. Now, so that's the grand total. Let's Let's look at Quebec because we live here. Let's see what happened here. So in Quebec, shock of shocks, the Liberals ended up with the same percentage of voters they had in all of the country, which is 43%. Now, who would ever think that in a province like Quebec, where the Liberals are definitely in the provincial level, they're practically confined only to the English part, only to Montreal and the English sections of the rest of the province, and that's it. They have practically no seats in any of the majority francophone ridings in this province outside of the island of Montreal and the suburbs of Montreal. And yet, that's on the provincial level. And yet on the federal level, look at what they did. 43% of the votes and 43 seats. So Quebec has 78 seats altogether. Of the 78 seats, Liberals got 43 of them. That's an enormous accomplishment in Quebec for the Liberals. Enormous. The Bloc Québécois ended up with 23 seats. And in percentage of the vote, they got 28% of the vote. Now, when we were looking at the polls, again, a few weeks ago, the Bloc Québécois was looking at the most of 25% of the vote, and they ended up with 28%. And at the least, they were going at 22%. So in the last week or two, the Bloc came up from their low of 22% to 28%. And of course, correspondingly, their seats went up. The Conservatives, they held their ground in Quebec. They got 11 seats, and they got 23% of the vote, which was pretty on par with what the polls were showing. And the NDP, God bless Andre Boulerice, he managed to keep his seat. He managed to keep his seat at a time when the NDP only got 4% of the vote in the whole province, but he kept his one seat that they had before because he has such a strong local following. And you know where his seat is? It's right in the plateau, right there. So these were the results from Quebec. You see the number adds up to 78. But look at how many seats the Liberals got. They got well over half of the seats. The Bloc Québécois in the last time had 35 seats. So they went down from 35 to 23. And they lost seats everywhere in the province, not just in one part, but pretty well everywhere. Now, let's talk about here. And I see Madame is in our audience. I met Anthony when I went to vote yesterday. I was voting at the Van Horn Recreation Center, and Anthony was standing outside the poll, the metro, and I shook his hand and I said, Anthony, I'm sure you're going to win. And when I opened the TV and all the results came in, it was Oberman by big numbers. So, you know, I'm sure that Anthony's mother and Anthony themselves looked at these results and said, oh my God, what's happening? But those votes came from Cote-Saint-Luc and Hampstead. Now, we know that the Jewish community in Montreal forms 30% of the voters in the Mount Royal riding. And the Jewish votes were counted, I think, before any of the other votes were counted, meaning that the votes in Cote-Saint-Luc and Hampstead got counted first before the votes in Cote-de-Snowden and in the town of Mount Royal. So The Jewish community, I'm guessing, the majority of that community voted for the Conservatives. Not obviously all, but certainly a majority, and especially the ones living in the Cote-Saint-Luc Hampstead area, and the ones living around the Lubavitch synagogue in Cote-Neige. Now, this vote by the Jewish community was not just in Montreal, which voted more strongly for the Conservatives, but also in Toronto. So there's 2 ridings in Toronto that have a very strong Jewish population. One is Thornhill, which the incumbent Melissa Lantzman won by 6. She got 65% of the vote in that riding. 65% in Toronto. That's the rest of Toronto. No, not the rest of Toronto. There was one seat that shifted in Toronto from the Liberals to the Conservatives. And that's the seat just underneath Lantzman's seat, York North. And there was a Jewish candidate there who was the incumbent, Yaara Sachs, I think born in Israel. And she lost. Now, she lost to the Conservatives. Because the Jewish vote in Toronto similarly shifted somewhat from the Liberals to the Conservatives. And so that explains that. There's no other seats in Toronto city area, and there's a lot of seats there that went to the Conservatives. Just those 2. So, you know, this anger with the Liberals over some of the lack of support of the state of Israel, lack of support of the Jewish community in Canada when the Jewish community was being attacked left, right, and center in all kinds of demonstrations and all kinds of you know, occupations and boycotts and insults and harassment, and even coming to shooting bullets into synagogues. The lukewarm, we'll call it a lukewarm reaction of the Liberal government, is what angered a lot of the Jewish community in Canada, and they showed their anger by voting for the Conservatives in this election. Now, I have to say, if we go back to the old days in this riding, when Irwin Cotler was the Member of Parliament, the riding of Mount Royal was the single largest majority riding of any riding in all of Canada for many elections. When I say a large majority, I'm talking about 90+% of the vote went to the Liberals. Not once, but maybe 3-4 times, or maybe more, in the olden days. And of course, we're so old that we remember the olden days. We do anyway. This time, Anthony Housefather managed to get just over 50% of the vote in this riding. And Oberman got 40%. Now, if you look at all the ridings in Montreal, there isn't any of them where the Conservatives got even close to 40%. The Conservatives, as you could see, won 11 seats in Quebec. Not one of them is anywhere close to Montreal. They're all around Quebec City. In the north part of the north shore of Quebec City and the south shore of Quebec City, those ridings have been Conservative now for a very long time, including the riding of Mr. Maxime Bernier, the head of the PPC party, who lost his seat again by a massive amount of votes. And if you ask me, he should look for another job. Very smart man. He ran for the leadership of the Conservative Party and almost won. And he was pushed out of winning actually by the Quebec dairy farmers. So this is the results here in Quebec. So we'll look 2:30. Okay. Let me just see if I have any other notes about Quebec. The Bloc actually won one seat from the Liberals in Quebec. So even though the Bloc was going down, they actually did win one seat from the Liberals in the Gaspé area. And also notable was the win of the Indigenous candidate running in the far north of Quebec. So the far north of Quebec really should have its own seat. In other words, the Inuit living in there and the Cree living there. There's not a lot of them, but they cover such a huge territory that they should have their own seat. But because there's not a lot of them, they're grouped in with Val d'Or, which is a French, of course, city. And because of that, the Bloc Québécois has won that seat several times. But this time, because of the shift to the Liberals, the Liberal candidate, who is a Cree woman, she won the seat. So this is a first in Quebec for the Liberals. There was an NDP Cree person who had won that seat before when the NDP had done well in Quebec. Okay, so that's that. Let's just talk. Are you interested in hearing about this, or would you like to hear something else? I don't know. It's up to you. So we're going to look at Ontario and British Columbia, and quickly we'll look at the rest of the places. But since Ontario is the biggest province, they have well over 100 seats. Whoever wins the election in Ontario pretty well wins the election in Canada. And let me see here. Yeah. So in percentage, in Ontario, the Liberals actually won half of the vote, 49.5% of the vote. And the Conservatives got 44.5%. So again, that same idea here, if you add the two together, you get 94% of the vote in Ontario went either to the Conservatives or to the Liberals. So the story of this election is that all the other parties were just abandoned, were just completely abandoned by the electorate, especially the NDP, especially that party. Now in seats, the Liberals got 69 and the Conservatives got 53. And in Ontario is where the Conservatives did the best. So they won. It was hard for me to actually look carefully, that they won 10 seats in this election that the Liberals had last time. And the Liberals won a couple of seats from the Conservatives that the Conservatives had last time. But all of the NDP seats in Ontario all went to the Liberals. So that explains how this happened. The NDP traditionally had a seat in Ottawa. They had seats in the Windsor sort of area. They had seats in. Me trying to remember where they had seats. It's hard for me. I'll think of it. Well, I'm sorry. Yeah, Windsor went all for the Conservatives. Oshawa, Ontario, where General Motors has their factory, where all of the union guys are living. The NDP got 7% of the vote in Oshawa. 7%. They used to have that seat. In Toronto itself, Jack Layton, he represented a seat in Toronto. There were a few NDP seats in Toronto at one point or other. All gone. All went to the Liberals. The Conservatives made their gains in some of the areas around Toronto, not what they call the GTA, the Greater Toronto Area, and around Kitchener, and some other ones here and there as well. So that's basically and so the NDP got zero seats in Ontario. That was that was one of their strongholds. We'll put it like that. In Ontario, The NDP ended up with 5% of the vote. Just 5. Yes, sir. East Canada and West Canada. Or Eastern Ontario, Western. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I have all of them. So what's noticeable here, what's notable is, and here's something that seems counterintuitive. The Conservatives did their best showing in Ontario, meaning compared to last time. And yet, Pierre Poilievre, who had won 4 elections in a row in his seat, lost his seat. How come? How come? No, not those. All those 95 other people got 10 votes between them. No. There's 2 reasons. There's 2 reasons. One is, and they both have to do with Trump. One is that Canadians are just so shocked about Trump and his personality and his attitude that anything that looks like or smells like or tastes like Trump, they didn't want it. That's number 1. Number 2, they saw what did Trump do to the civil service in the United States. He has fired well over 100,000 people from the civil service. Poilievre was running in Ottawa, Carleton. It's a suburb of Ottawa. Basically, it's a suburb of Ottawa. The people, it's not Ottawa itself, but the people who live there work in Ottawa. And of course, you know, they could put 2 and 2 together and say, if this guy gets in, he's going to do what Trump is doing to Washington. He didn't lose by 2 votes. He lost by, it was like 49% to 45%. He lost by a reasonable amount of votes. It wasn't like down to the wire. And like I said, when the Conservatives were doing worse in the last election and the one before, he won his seat handily. And now this time when the Conservatives came up so much in Ontario, he lost. So I'm sure it's a shock to him. I'm sure it's a shock to, no one was predicting that. People were predicting that Jagmeet Singh would lose his seat, and he lost big time. What percentage of the vote did Jagmeet Singh get in his riding in Burnaby? 18%. 18%. Think of it. That's a party leader who's been around now for quite a long time, since Jack Layton passed away. And he lost. He came in 3rd place, not 2nd, 3rd. So it tells you what a devastation the NDP suffered. They had 24 seats in the last parliament. They're now down to 7. And one of the 7 is in Nunavut, which I would say doesn't count, because they have 5,000 voters in the whole place. So that doesn't count. So they're leading in 2 seats, one of which is Nunavut. So assuming they win the other seat, they'll barely get up to 7 from 24. So if you want to know how did the Liberals win the election, it's because they got all the NDP seats that got lost. And they had a disastrous showing. They won 1 in Quebec. They won 1 in Edmonton. They won, I think, 1 in Winnipeg and just 2 in BC. That's it. BC, they had over 13 seats in BC. So that kind of explains that. Let's turn the page. Now you were talking about, and people talk about Western alienation, right? So let's look at Manitoba, the next province over. I skipped the Maritimes. Because they went overwhelmingly for the Liberals, but just as the polls predicted, nothing sort of out of the ordinary, right? The Liberals got over half the votes in the Maritimes. But that's, the Maritimes, you know, don't have a lot of seats, number 1. And number 2, there wasn't anything special that happened there. So that's why I'm leaving it out. And we don't have that much time. Let's look at Manitoba, the beginning of the prairies. And if people want to talk about Western alienation, Manitoba has 14 seats. Conservatives got 7, Liberals got 6, the NDP got 1. In percentage, 47 to 41 to 11. So this to me doesn't, looking at these results, of course, all the Liberal seats came in Winnipeg. But this doesn't tell you, this doesn't give you the idea that there is a terrible split in Canada up until this point. Because the Liberals did pretty darn good with 41% of the vote in Manitoba. That's a pretty strong showing, I would have to say. That's a really good showing. And I think, let me see, yeah, I think that, yes, the one of the seats they won is Churchill, Manitoba, which covers like half the province, the whole top. So that, you know, even in geography doesn't look so bad. So now we're going to skip over that. Let's look at Saskatchewan. And this is Saskatchewan and Alberta are really where the Conservatives did hugely well, but as expected. Nothing too shocking. So in Saskatchewan, the Conservatives got 13 seats, the Liberals got 1. Now you think of it, you know, that in the olden days, Tommy Douglas, he came from Regina. You know, Saskatchewan in the olden days voted NDP pretty strongly because of the farmers associations and all of that. In Alberta, which gained some seats because of the redistribution of seats, so some seats were added to the parliament, 1 in Ontario, a couple in, I think, Alberta, and 1 in BC. So in Canada, we never take seats away from people. We just keep adding on. That means that one day in the near future, the House of Commons will have to move across the street and they'll have to put seats all on the lawn of the Parliament building because they're not taking any seats and any more seats, and the population keeps growing. So they have to keep adding seats. In the United States, they have a fixed number of seats. Every 10 years there's a census. If you lose population, they take seats away. If they add population, they add seats. So that's their system, to keep the same number of seats. But in Canada, we're so nice. We don't want to insult anybody. We don't want to say, oh, you know, you're too small. Your province doesn't deserve any more representation. We'll just keep adding seats. So the seats that get added go to the fastest growing parts of the country, which are BC, Alberta, and Ontario. So even Quebec got 3 extra seats in the last go around. Not this go around, but the last go around. So Alberta has a whole bunch of seats now. And in Alberta, the Conservatives got 34. The Liberals got actually 2, and the NDP got 1. NDP got 1. So now you could see, if you look at these 2 numbers, you could see what a huge majority the Conservatives have and how ineffective their vote is. Because if they win so many votes in one place, it adds to their vote total, but it doesn't add to their seat total because they win so much. You understand what I'm saying? So look at the percentage here. Let's look at the percentage of votes. So remember, in Quebec, it was all in the 40s, right? The percentage of vote in Saskatchewan for the Conservatives, 65. The percentage of votes for the Conservatives in Alberta, 65. And the Liberals, the same basic numbers, 28 and 27. So the same number for there, and the NDP is the leftovers. The Liberals actually got more, sorry, this is 28 and this is 27. So the Liberals actually got a bigger percentage of their votes in Alberta, which is supposed to be our most conservative province, than they did in Saskatchewan, where they only got 27% of the vote. So you could see, even in, in the vote percentages match the seat percentages to a certain degree. Overwhelmingly conservative in popular vote and overwhelmingly conservative in the seats. Of course, it doesn't add up mathematically, because a quarter of the seats would be more than the Liberals got, but that's the way our system works. So let's go to BC, because we're gonna finish answering your question about Western alienation. And you heard today, Preston Manning said, if things keep up like this, the West is going to separate. Okay, so we see that Manitoba, there's no real push on that score. I'm just going to finish with BC, and then we'll talk about something else. Let me find it. Where's my BC? That's right where I'm looking. BC, seats, Liberals 20, Conservatives 19, NDP 3, and the Green Party 1. So in percentage, in the seat numbers, you can see the Liberals got more than the Conservatives. In the percentage of seats, 42, 41 and a half. The NDP 13. So it's the NDP is their strongest, and the Green Party got 3%. So look, if any province, if there's provinces that are upset, really it should only be Saskatchewan and Alberta, because the rest of the provinces all voted pretty well for the Liberals, pretty well. So this explains and even in BC to get 42% for the Liberals, considering how many parties there are running there, that's a huge accomplishment. So let me just, by saying a couple of notes, I look down at all the ridings and all the people running. First of all, the Sikh population of Canada is running for office like you wouldn't believe. The number of Sikhs running in Calgary and winning, and in British Columbia and Surrey, and in Ontario and Brampton, it's like you look at this thing, you think that we must have a population of Sikhs in Canada, which is like over 10 or 15%, by looking at the numbers of people who are running for office. And they don't just run for one party. They run for all the parties. The Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, the NDP Party. The number of Indian names, and almost all of them are Sikh names. And then we also have a huge number of Muslim names running in the cities in Toronto and some other places. We have a huge representation of and I hate this word, non-white. I hate the word, but we have a huge representation of people who are neither French Canadians nor English Canadians running and winning seats in Parliament. Enormous number. I would say much more than their percentage in the population. And even in Quebec, we had a huge number of people running who are neither French Canadians nor English Canadians. A large number, even some for the Bloc Québécois. In this riding, they ran a Russian, the Bloc Québécois. Where they found him, I have no idea, but his name was Igor. So what it does show is that, unlike in, for example, maybe in Scandinavia or maybe in Germany, the minorities who come to this country from the third world, from India, from the Arab countries, are assimilating into our society, are becoming citizens, and to the point where they're running and getting elected to Parliament. And I think that only shows what a great country this is, that this could happen that way. So that's my short but brief take on the election results. So the yeah. Yeah. Okay. And really, and like I said, just to sum up, it's the best result possible in a sense. So the Liberals don't have a majority, meaning that they could do any stupid thing they want. They have two sidekicks that they can rely on, the Bloc and the NDP. So if one sidekick doesn't agree, they can go with the other one and still run the country. And the Conservatives did really quite well enough to form a strong opposition that has to be listened to. So I think we got the best of both worlds in terms of the structure, the structure of the parliament. So that's about it. Now I'm going to talk about, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to take some questions and then I'm going to talk to you about 5 minutes for something completely different. Two interesting stories that I read in my, repertoire of reading. I came across two interesting stories. One story is about Moroccans who live in Vietnam. And the other story is about Polish people living in Uganda. So I'll take any questions that you have about the elections, and then I'll tell you those two stories, and we'll finish with that. So this is my last class because next week I'm going to Korea, China, and Taiwan for a month. So when I come back, I can tell you all about those places. Like those are important places, far more important places than Canada is, by the way. No questions about the elections? Okay, so the first story I'm going to tell about is Moroccans in Vietnam. So there's a community of Moroccans living in Vietnam, and the question is, how did they get there? And the answer is, it goes back to the French rule over Morocco. France kind of took over Morocco in 1912. France conscripted Moroccan soldiers to fight with them wherever they wanted to fight. And the Moroccan men who signed up for the French army were people who basically they were sort of promised a salary. They were promised high status in society because they were soldiers, and they had basically nothing else to do because it was a poor country. There was no jobs, and so long as they spoke French and were able-bodied, the French army was happy to take them. And of course, the French army used them as the first to go. In other words, just like the Russians are throwing God knows who in the front lines, the French did the same thing to all of their colonial soldiers, and they sent them all over the world. Now, when the Second World War happened, France was taken over by the Germans, and the French who were fighting outside of Europe were still run by de Gaulle from England, and were still fighting on the side of the Allies in different parts of the world. But after the Second World War was over, there was a revolution in Vietnam, and you may remember Ho Chi Minh, led the Vietnamese Communist Party, took over Vietnam, or even part of Vietnam, and declared the independence of Vietnam. But France, who now sort of was reestablished after the Second World War as a republic, they didn't agree to allow Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos to end up out of French hands. So they sent soldiers over to Vietnam to try to retake Vietnam. And among those soldiers were, of course, lots of Moroccans. Now, remember that already this was in 1954. There, in Morocco itself, there was an independence movement that got started after the Second World War that said, we want to be free of France also. And many of the soldiers who went there were people who believed in independence of Morocco. So when they got to Vietnam, there were people from the Moroccan Communist Party who went to Vietnam to try to encourage the Moroccans to desert. The Moroccan soldiers to desert the French troops and go over to the Viet Cong. Because they said, look, this is one step in your liberation of Morocco, would be to make sure that France is defeated in Vietnam. So some thousands of them did that. They did that. They just either went, not en masse, but 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Some of them even shot French soldiers to escape, to get out of the French army, to go over to the north. And of course, France was defeated in that war, and France, you know, just took their soldiers home. But the soldiers who the soldiers who deserted from the French army, they couldn't go back because France still was in charge of Morocco and in charge of France. They would have been put in jail. They would have been charged with treason, who knows what. So the Vietnam government now, under the Viet Cong, established a Moroccan village in Vietnam, near Hanoi, for all the families of all these soldiers. Not the families, they were only men, right? They built an arch, like a Moroccan arch, you know, like a, you know, Oriental arch over this village. And what happened was, of course, these Vietnamese soldiers ended up marrying, these Moroccan soldiers ended up marrying Vietnamese women, because that's the only women around. And there were no Moroccan women serving in the French army, God forbid, you know. So this little colony, we'll call it, or a little strange apparition, got itself established in Vietnam, a place which is hot, humid, jungly, rainy, completely non-Middle Eastern, completely non-Muslim, completely. What's the national food of Vietnam? What do you think? Pork, right? Right. I mean, you know, you know, of course, if they're, you know, in hard times, they didn't have much of it. But if you go to any Vietnamese restaurant, you'll see plenty of it on the menu. And these soldiers adapted to the life in Vietnam. They had children. The children, of course, learned Vietnamese. These were mixed children, obviously, half Arab and half Vietnamese. 1956 rolls around, and Morocco becomes independent. And it takes a while, but King Hassan, the first king of independent Morocco, remembers, or is told, there's a bunch of Moroccans living in Vietnam, and he says anybody who wants to come from Vietnam to Morocco can come and live in Morocco. So now the people had a choice. Do we stay or do we leave? The answer is, of course, some stayed and some left. Now, the ones who left went with their Vietnamese wives to Morocco. Imagine a Vietnamese person living in Vietnam with that climate and that culture, you know, and that language, moving to the Middle East, to some village, you know, off of the beaten track in Morocco, where they set up a village. And instead of putting a Moroccan arch there, they put like a Vietnamese arch, you know, like with a pagoda style arch in the middle of this half desert place. And so they lived there. The kids ended up having to learn how to speak Arabic, which they didn't do in Vietnam. And you have, you know, one village in Vietnam that has Moroccans in it, and one village in Morocco that has Vietnamese in it. And they were just saying that, of course, after a while, yeah, and they were sort of left there, dumped there, and forgotten. The government did nothing to help them out. And you know, gradually time passed, And, you know, at least the Vietnamese living in Morocco had an advantage because they knew French and they could speak French and ended up getting, the women ended up, you know, working because there was work available and they moved into the cities. And so today, you know, these communities are both mostly dead because of just general moving around. When you know, when freedom came, let's say in Morocco, they could move to France, they could move to who knows where, Quebec, God, maybe who knows where. And so it's just two interesting stories of how this community it got established and what happened to it. So they say that the old lady, now we're talking now 2 generations later from 1950s, late 50s. So there's still some old ladies living in Morocco who are Vietnamese who, you know, on a national holiday will get dressed up in their costumes and sing Vietnamese songs. But their children are all assimilated to Morocco, just as the children left in Vietnam are also assimilated to Vietnam. Okay, story number one. Story number two, Poles in Uganda. This is something a bit more familiar to us. This has to do with the prequel to the Second World War. And you will start off with of course, Nazis come to power in Germany in the 1930s, and Stalin is in power in the Soviet Union in the 1930s. And the two countries made an agreement called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which basically said that Russia or the Soviet Union and Germany will divide Poland between them. Germany will take the western part of Poland, and Russia could take the eastern part of Poland. And this was a pact that was signed in early 1939. And Russia immediately moved into their part of Poland and took it over. The eastern part of Poland, including the city, for example, of Lvov or Lviv, which is now in the Ukraine. And the Germans didn't move into their part of Poland. So when the Russians moved into their part of Poland, anybody who they considered a, you know, non-communist sympathizer, any religious leaders, any intellectuals, any nationalists, they arrested. And they sent them all off to Kazakhstan, Siberia, and God knows where else, just to get them out of Poland, out of what used to be Poland. Now, I'm not talking about Jewish people. I'm talking now about Christian Catholic Poles who were opponents of the Soviet Union being sent off to the wilderness there. Any Jews who ended up going east were the lucky ones because they didn't end up getting killed in the Holocaust. But somewhere around 300,000 Poles were exiled from Poland by the Soviet Union in 1939, 1940, and they went off to live in the East. Now, you know, it's horrible to say this, but Hitler made a terrible mistake in invading the Soviet Union in 1941. Because had he not invaded, of course, had he not invaded, millions of Jews would have been saved because the ones who were, you know, living in what became the Ukraine and White Russia were all killed. But he, you know, he somehow or other, Hitler got great ideas and he said, look, it was so easy for me to conquer all of Europe, I might as well keep on going and go into Russia and maybe end up in Iraq and take all the oil that's around the Persian Gulf. So he had these grandiose ideas. But once he invaded Russia, then all of a sudden the Poles who were living in Russia became kind of allies instead of being enemies. Because at this point or other, Russia joined the war on the Allied side, on the side of France and Great Britain, for example. And the Poles who were living there, now instead of being enemies, they were recruited as soldiers by when the Germans took over Poland, right? So the Polish army that was there, that was able to escape, they wanted to continue to fight Germany. And because Germany invaded the Soviet Union, now the Soviet Union had to fight Germany. So the Poles who were living in the Soviet Union, who were considered to be enemies of the state, all of a sudden they're on the same side as the Soviet Union. So what happened was that these 300,000 people, first of all, the men got organized into an army representing Poland, run by the British. And what the British did was, it took those people out of the Soviet Union and put them in Iran, because Iran was like a neutral country. And they took those people to sort of build up an army so that if ever the Germans came somehow, that direction, the Poles would be able to oppose them. And if necessary, the Polish army could be moved to where the fighting was in Europe. So that was the British plan. After a while, but remember, these were not like the Moroccans, just soldiers. These were people with their families. These were, thousands of people who were refugees, we'll call them, in the Soviet Union, all of a sudden got a chance to leave the Soviet Union, and they started off in Iran. After a while, the British said to themselves, you know what? Looking after all these people in Iran is, number one, expensive, and number two, things could be dangerous because the Germans were hoping to take over Iran. So what they decided to do is move them to Africa, so to British possessions in Africa, where they would be safe, number one. And number two, they wouldn't cost the British government money because they could settle themselves in Africa and work as farmers or work in something to support themselves. So the British sent thousands, not hundreds, thousands of Polish people to Kenya, Uganda, what used to be Tanganyika, what used to be Northern Rhodesia, what used to be Southern Rhodesia, and what is South Africa. So the total number was somewhere around 50,000 people that they moved to these places. Now, they moved them, but they had nothing. Remember, these were people who had lived in the Soviet Union for 2 years, so they were robbed of everything they had. So they had nothing, zero possessions, zero money. And the British, in the case of Uganda, sent them out, not to the cities. They sent them out to the countrysides because they wanted these people to be farmers and to be workers and, to support themselves and not to cause trouble. So there was this Polish community established in Uganda, 7,000 people. And basically they were on their own. So they had to figure out what to do. They started farming. They started, little mini workshops and stuff like that. And they ended up, but they were living very poorly. They lived in huts, the same mud huts and grass huts that the Africans lived in. So when British travelers came by and looked at these people, the British ruled Uganda. So they had a white ruling class who were sort of here on the top. Then they had lots of Asians, God bless those Asians, because they're the ones who could carry out business. They were the ones who could do all the clerical work for the British. And then underneath were all the millions of Africans who were, the poorest people who were, looked down as the lowest class. But when travelers passed through and saw all these Poles living like Africans, it didn't quite it didn't make sense. Because how could there be poor white people in a country that's ruled by the whites? That's number one. Number two, that if the Polish men often were in the army, so they were sent somewhere else. The women were it was mostly women living in these places. They started to have relationships with the blacks, which of course went completely against the whole British sensibility of, who's the boss and who's not the boss. In any event, what happened was that when the war ended in 1945, people were more or less free to do whatever they wanted. And these communities in Africa, the Polish people, pretty well, they had a choice. Sorry, they could have gone back to Poland. But who's going to go back to Poland when the communists were ruling Poland? That's the last thing they wanted to do. But they ended up going wherever they went, wherever they wanted to go. So they could have gone to Britain. They could have gone to. They went to Britain. They went to Australia. Some went to the U.S. Some went to South Africa and stayed there. Well, you know, joined the white population there. Maybe some came here. I don't know. But the settlements that they had there, and they had built a nice church in this town. They were all abandoned. After Poland became a free country, in other words, in 2000 and I'm gonna I don't want to mix up the date. 2017, I think it was, or 2011. Let me see what it was. No, 2021. In 2021, the Polish government went to this village where these Poles were living, and they built a whole health community center hospital for the Ugandan people who sort of sheltered these Poles for all this time. So that's kind of a nice little story of how it ended. Anyway, that's two interesting stories of Poles in Uganda and Moroccans in Vietnam and Vietnamese in Morocco that you would never think about. So anyway, I want to thank you all for coming. I'll be back in June, and I hope, and you know, I hope that you have a good month off, and we'll see you then. I'm here if you want to ask questions. I'm still here. So thanks again.